The red icons pulsed on the holographic map like a terminal diagnosis. In the anemic, recycled air of the Global Command Operations Center, each throb was a countdown to catastrophe. A 12-man special operations team, call sign Pathfinder, was surrounded, their exfiltration window shrinking with every report of enemy armor closing on their position in the Alborz Mountains. They held intel that could tip the scales of the entire conflict, but the mountains themselves, bristling with the most sophisticated integrated air defense system the Alliance had ever faced, had become their cage. Status on the rescue package? General Theron's voice was a low grind of granite, worn down by 40 years of command and the unyielding mathematics of war. A young lieutenant, Davies, swallowed hard before speaking. Sir, Eagle Squadron was repelled by heavy SAM activity. 2 F-15s damaged. We lost a Reaper drone trying to get a better look. The IADS is fully active. It's a fortress. Theron's gaze swept across the tactical display, a three-dimensional nightmare of overlapping circles representing enemy radar coverage, missile engagement envelopes, and fighter patrol routes. They called the valley where Pathfinder was trapped the crucible nothing sent in had come out. The data was irrefutable, the simulations run a dozen times with the same grim result. 100% asset loss. We've analyzed every ingress route, every possible seam in their coverage, the general stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. He was speaking to his senior staff, but his words were meant to be a final verdict. The EW spectrum is saturated. Their S-400 batteries are cross-linked with short-range Panzer systems, and they have fighter cover circling at 25,000 feet. Sending another conventional strike or rescue force in there isn't a calculated risk. It's a suicide run. He let the words hang in the silent room, a verbal tombstone for the men on the ground. The mission was a failure. The men were gone. It was a matter of accepting the inevitable. Sir, Davies began, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the funereal atmosphere. All eyes turned to him. He felt a hot flush of panic but pushed on, gesturing to a small, overlooked detail on the personnel roster. There is one asset currently on standby at Al Dafra. A single Raptor. An operations colonel scoffed. One plane? Against that? Lieutenant, did you not just hear the general? I did, sir, Davies said, his eyes fixed on Theron. But the pilot is Major Rostova. The name didn't cause a ripple of recognition among most of the senior staff, but Theron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew the name, Major Eva Rostova, call sign Valkyrie. Her file was a paradox, a collection of glowing commendations for unparalleled flight performance, interspersed with reprimands for insubordination and deviation from established doctrine. She was a prodigy in the cockpit and a problem on the ground. Her simulators were flawless, but her solutions in the field were dangerously unpredictable, relying on an instinct that couldn't be quantified or replicated in his precious models. Major Rostova's unorthodox methods are a liability in a coordinated operation, Theron said, his voice dropping to a dismissive chill. Her profile suggests a pilot who trusts her gut over the data. In an environment this lethal, the data is all that matters. The variables are too great for one pilot, one aircraft, no matter how skilled. He turned away. A clear signal that the discussion was over. Begin drafting the notification protocols. I'm calling it. The room deflated, a collective sigh of grim acceptance. But Davies kept his eyes on the screen, on the small, unblinking green light indicating Major Rostova's F-22 was armed, fueled, and ready. The general saw a liability. The data saw an anomaly. Davies, who had read every after-action report Rostova had ever filed, saw the only glimmer of a chance they had left. He thought of the men in the crucible, their icons about to be grayed out on the map, and a cold certainty settled in his stomach. The general had called it a suicide run. Perhaps it was. But if anyone could fly into hell and come back with singed wings, it was the woman the system refused to trust. The hangar at Al Dafra was a cathedral of shadows and low, humming sodium lights. In its center rested the F-22 Raptor, its angular lines and radar-absorbent skin making it look less like a machine and more like a predator carved from solid twilight. It wasn't just any Raptor. It was hers. Major Eva Rostova was already there, moving around the aircraft with the quiet, focused grace of a surgeon examining a patient before a critical operation. She didn't rely on the ground crew's sign-offs alone. She had a ritual. Her flight suit was immaculate but worn, the fabric softened by 1,000 hours of use. Sewn onto her left shoulder was a small, ghost-gray patch depicting a skeletal rider on a winged horse, the insignia of a disbanded, Black Ops aviation unit whose records were sealed so tight they practically didn't exist. It was the only piece of her past she carried with her. Her gloved fingers traced the seams of the fuselage, feeling for the slightest imperfection. They paused on a spot just below the cockpit canopy, a patch of skin no different in color but subtly different in texture. It was a weld mark, smoothed and repainted, but she could feel its history. A scar from a near miss with a surface-to-air missile over a forgotten desert 2 years ago. She and the jet had earned that scar together. They spoke a language that had no words, a communion of pilot and machine forged in pressure and fire. This aircraft wasn't a tool. It was a comrade. She completed her walk around and ascended the boarding ladder, her movements economical and precise. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. As she settled into the ejection seat, the world outside the polycarbonate canopy vanished. Here, in the confines of the cockpit, was her sanctuary. The scent of ozone, scrubbed air, and warm electronics was more familiar to her than any home. She strapped herself in, the clicks of the buckles echoing in the sudden, profound silence. Her hands moved over the controls with an intimacy born of countless hours of flight. She didn't just press buttons. She knew the exact pressure required for each one. The subtle give in the throttle, the weight of the side stick controller in her palm. The pre-flight checklist was a litany she performed from memory, her fingers dancing across the illuminated panels. Canopy down. The low hydraulic hiss sealed her away from the world. A flick of a switch, and the integrated cockpit display flickered to life, bathing her face in a soft emerald glow. Data streams flowed across her helmet-mounted display, a river of information she absorbed not as individual numbers but as a single coherent picture of her aircraft's health. Engines, hydraulics, weapon systems, all green. Already. A voice, tinny and distant, crackled in her ear. "Valkyrie, you have a go from command. Mission is greenlit. You are cleared for solo sortie." It was the young lieutenant from the ops center. His voice carried a tension that bordered on awe. Rostova didn't reply immediately. She took one slow, deliberate breath, her lungs filling with the cool, filtered air of her life support system. She wasn't thinking about the odds, the general's dismissal, or the impossibility of the task. She was thinking of the wind, the pressure, the angle of attack. She was feeling the mission ahead, not calculating it. Her hand closed around the throttle. "Copy," she said, her voice a flat, calm monotone that betrayed nothing. "Valkyrie is in the air." With a final check, she nudged the throttles forward. The twin Pratt and Whitney engines spooled up from a whisper to a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through her bones and shook the very foundations of the hangar. She was no longer Major Rostova. She was an extension of the 200,000 pounds of thrust at her back. She was Valkyrie, and she was going hunting. The Raptor lifted off the runway with a ferocious grace, a ghost climbing into the ink-black, pre-dawn sky. It didn't claw for altitude. It ascended, a surge of raw power so smooth it felt less like flying and more like the earth was simply falling away beneath her. Within minutes, she was over the Persian Gulf, a silver needle stitching through the darkness, her presence utterly unknown to the world below. Her flight plan was a jagged, aggressive line pointing straight towards the hostile territory, towards the mountain range they called the Dragon's Teeth. Standard ingress doctrine would have dictated a high-altitude approach, skirting the edges of enemy radar until a strike window opened. Rostova's plan was the antithesis of standard. She was heading for the heart of a brewing thunderstorm that Meteorological Command had flagged as a no-fly zone. To General Theron, the storm was an unacceptable variable. To Rostova, it was cover. As she approached the mountains, the air grew agitated. The first tremors of turbulence shivered through the airframe, a gentle nudge that soon became a violent, shuddering buck. The sky outside her canopy was no longer black but a churning chaos of bruised purple and gray clouds, lit from within by blinding flashes of sheet lightning. The jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the dragon's teeth appeared in these stroboscopic bursts, looking like the skeletal maw of some colossal beast. Rain, thick and torrential, began to lash against the canopy, the sound not of a drizzle but of a million tiny hammers trying to beat their way in. An alarm blared, a proximity warning for a wind shear. Her hands on the stick were fluid, instinctive. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was dancing with it. Where the turbulence tried to throw her left, she eased into the motion, using its energy to guide her through a narrow pass. Where an updraft threatened to send her spiraling, she dipped a wing and let it carry her over a razor-sharp ridge she hadn't even seen on her topographical display. This was flying beyond the manual, beyond the carefully calibrated limits of the simulator. This was a conversation with the elements. The Raptor, designed for stable, high-altitude performance, groaned under the strain. The airframe creaked, and the flight computer flashed warnings she dismissed with a flick of her thumb. She could feel the stress on the wings, the torque on the fuselage, as if the machine's nerve endings were extensions of her own. She trusted it to hold together, and in return, the jet gave her everything it had. Inside the cockpit, the maelstrom was reduced to sound and motion. The rhythmic thump of her own breathing in the oxygen mask was a steady anchor in the chaos. Her gaze was locked ahead, but her awareness was everywhere, processing the data from her avionics and the raw, physical feedback from the airframe simultaneously. The helmet display painted a synthetic view of the terrain ahead, a wireframe ghost world overlaid on the violent reality outside. She flew through canyons illuminated only by lightning, her wingtips mere feet from rock walls that could shred titanium like paper. For 20 agonizing minutes, she wrestled with the storm, using its fury as a shield. Any ground-based radar trying to find her would see only the massive energy signature of the weather front, a ghost in the machine of nature's own making. She was through. The turbulence subsided as she exited the storm's core, the rain fading to a light hiss. Before her, the sky cleared, revealing a valley bathed in the cold, gray light of approaching dawn. The crucible. The air here was eerily calm, but her threat display told a different story. It blossomed with yellow and red symbols. She had arrived. The IADS was awake and listening. The calm was deceptive, a predator's stillness before the strike. As Valkyrie's Raptor cleared the last ridge of the dragon's teeth, the silent, passive listening of the enemy network turned into active searching. Her tactical display, which had been a clean slate of green terrain, began to populate with hostile signatures. A spiderweb of overlapping search cones from ground-based radar flickered to life, sweeping the valley. Her target was the nexus of that web. Deep in a mountain pass, shielded by granite and camouflage netting, was a NEBOM long-range acquisition radar. It was the eye of the enemy IADS, the component that could detect stealth aircraft at a distance and cue the more precise, deadlier S-400 batteries. Standard doctrine called for a long-range, high-altitude strike with standoff munitions. But the NEBOM was designed specifically to counter that threat. It would see a high-flying asset coming from 100 miles away. Rostova did the opposite. She pushed the stick forward, diving the Raptor toward the valley floor. The ground rushed up to meet her, the altimeter unwinding at a dizzying rate. She leveled out less than 200 feet above the rocky, scrub-covered terrain, a silver wraith screaming through the canyons. At this altitude, she was beneath the radar's minimum detection floor. She was a needle in a haystack of ground clutter. Flying this low at this speed was a razor's edge. Her focus narrowed to a pinpoint, her entire consciousness poured into the act of flight. The world became a blur of rock and shadow, her inputs on the control's subtle, preemptive corrections for shifts in wind and terrain. The flight computer struggled to keep up, but her instincts were faster. She anticipated the curve of the canyon before it appeared on her display, felt the downdraft from a cliff face an instant before it hit her. Her helmet-mounted display highlighted the target location, still miles away and shielded by a massive rock formation. She couldn't go over it. She'd be seen. She had to go around. She banked hard, the G-force pressing her deep into her seat, her vision tunneling as the blood drained from her head. The Raptor responded instantly, its thrust-vectoring nozzles angling the engine exhaust to pivot the aircraft with physics-defying agility. She rounded the final bend, and the target was there. The massive, slowly rotating antenna of the Nebo-M, nestled in its fortified position. She had a 10-second window before its rotation would bring her into its direct line of sight. Her thumb flicked the weapon's select switch. Internal bay doors, designed to open and close in less than a second to maintain stealth, snapped open. A single GBU-32 JDAM dropped from its mooring. Bay doors closed. The entire sequence was a silent, lethal whisper. She didn't wait to see the impact. She was already pulling up, rolling the Raptor onto its side and threading it through another narrow rock chasm, putting a mountain between herself and the impending explosion. In the command center, thousands of miles away, a technician stared at his screen in disbelief. One of the largest red circles on the holographic map, the one representing the Nebo-MS coverage, had simply vanished. "Sir, we've lost the primary acquisition radar in Sector Gamma," he announced, his voice tight with shock. "Impact source unknown. No launch transient detected." Lieutenant Davies leaned forward, his heart pounding. He knew. Could only be one person. He keyed his mic to the encrypted channel, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "Control to all stations, be advised." That was Valkyrie. The call sign hung in the sterile air of the command room. It was no longer just a name on a roster. It was a tangible event. A ghost had just blinded the enemy, and the hunt had only just begun. Blinding the IADS was like kicking a hornet's nest. The system, though hobbled, was not dead. It was now furious. Deprived of its primary long-range eyes, the enemy network fell back on its other senses. Automated protocols, triggered by the loss of the Nebo-M, scrambled their top-tier air superiority fighters. 2 Sukhoi Su-57 equivalents, designated felons by Alliance intelligence, lifted off from a concealed airbase, their mission order simple and brutal: find and destroy the anomaly that had just decapitated their command and control. In Valkyrie's cockpit, the tactical display updated with the new threats. 2 red chevrons appeared to the east, moving fast, their flight paths converging on her last known position. They were hunters, and she was the prey. The conventional response would be to disengage, to use the F-22 superior stealth to fade away and wait for another opportunity. To run. But the pathfinders on the ground were running out of time. Running was not an option. In the command center, the mood had shifted from grim resignation to high-strung tension. General Theron stood before the main display, arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He had watched the Nebo-M icon disappear, had heard the stunned reports. His rigid, data-driven worldview had just been fractured by a single, impossible action. The unacceptable variable he had dismissed was now the only card he had left to play. He saw the 2 felons streaking towards her position on the map. His models predicted her chances of survival in a 2-on-1 engagement at less than 10%. He turned to his communications officer, his voice clipped and decisive. "Get her a direct feed from the rivet joint. I want her to have the full SIGINT picture. Real-time telemetry, enemy comms intercepts, everything. Give her all of it. Now." It was an unprecedented move, granting a lone pilot in the field direct access to the most sensitive intelligence-gathering assets in the theater. It was a delegation of authority he would have considered reckless an hour ago. Now, it felt like the only logical move. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that the pilot in that cockpit was processing the battle space faster and more effectively than his entire command staff. It was a profound grant of trust. Aboard the Raptor, a new stream of data flooded Rostova's displays. Encrypted enemy communications, the exact frequencies of the felon's search radars, their engine outputs, a complete sensory map of her adversaries. Davies' voice came over the comm, steadying. "Valkyrie, command has opened the pipe. You're seeing what we're seeing. 2 felons inbound, bearing 090, Angels 30-inch. Solid copy, Rostova replied, her tone as calm as if she were acknowledging a weather report. She processed the new information in a heartbeat. The felons were flying a standard search and destroy pattern, confident that their superior numbers and powerful radars would find any target. They expected her to be high or running. She would do neither. Instead of pushing the throttle to escape, she pulled it back, bleeding speed. She dipped a wing and let the Raptor slide gracefully back towards the mountains she had just exited. She wasn't retreating. She was choosing her battlefield. She was turning to face them, but on her own terms. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The enemy fighters were closing the distance with terrifying speed, their powerful radars sweeping the sky. Rostova knew that even with the F-22 stealth, a direct confrontation in open air was a high-risk gamble. She needed an equalizer. She needed the terrain. She pushed the nose of the Raptor down again, this time aiming for a massive, winding canyon system that snaked its way through the mountains. A geological scar known on her charts as the Serpent's Gulch, diving into it was an act of controlled insanity. Flying at over 600 miles per hour within a chasm barely 3 times her wingspan wide was not covered in any training manual. It was a maneuver that lived in the realm of legend and folklore, a place where pilots either forged their legacy or died instantly. The moment she dropped below the canyon rim, the world transformed. The sky vanished, replaced by sheer, vertical walls of granite that ripped past her canopy. The sunlight was a remote sliver far above. The noise of her engines, contained by the rock, became a deafening, continuous explosion. The G-forces were immense and relentless as she followed the tortuous path of the ancient riverbed. Her inputs on the side stick were minuscule, almost subconscious twitches of her wrist, each one a life-or-death decision. This was her signature move, the one that had earned her both commendations and reprimands. She wasn't just flying an aircraft, she was wearing it. The Raptor became an extension of her will, its vectoring nozzles and advanced flight controls responding to her intent before she was even consciously aware of it. She used the canyon's echoes to her advantage, her radar signature bouncing and scattering off the rock walls, creating a hall of mirrors for the hunters above. To them, she would be a ghost, a flicker, a data error. The lead felon pilot, frustrated, broke formation and dove low, trying to get a clearer look into the gulch. It was the mistake she had been waiting for. On her display, she saw him enter the canyon mouth a few miles behind her. He was fast, aggressive, and overconfident. She let him close the distance, the proximity alarm screaming in her ears. He was on her tail, hunting for a missile lock. Then she did the impossible. In a straight, narrow section of the canyon, she pulled back hard on the stick and slammed the throttles forward, simultaneously engaging her thrust vectoring nozzles. The Raptor's nose pitched up violently, its forward momentum instantly converting into a vertical climb within the confines of the canyon. The aircraft stood on its tail, effectively stopping in midair and letting the speeding felon shoot straight past underneath her. It was a modified Pugachev's Cobra, a maneuver that defied conventional aerodynamics, performed in a space with zero margin for error. For a breathtaking second, she was hovering, suspended between the canyon walls, the felon pilot staring up in disbelief as he overshot his target. That second was all she needed. As the Raptor's nose fell back down, her systems had already acquired a perfect, unmissable weapons lock. "Fox 2, she breathed, her voice steady. A single AIM-9X Sidewinder leaped from its internal bay. The missile didn't have to travel far. It slammed into the felon's cockpit, turning the advanced fighter into a blossoming fireball that lit up the canyon like a miniature sun. The second felon pilot, seeing his wingman's icon vanish in a burst of digital static, broke off his pursuit immediately. He pulled his aircraft into a steep, panicked climb, abandoning the hunt and fleeing back towards the safety of his base. He had just witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. He had seen a ghost, and it had teeth. Valkyrie was alone in the canyon again, the echo of the explosion her only companion. Emerging from the Serpent's Gulch was like being born into the light. Rostova's Raptor shot out from the canyon mouth, banking hard over the valley where the Pathfinder team was making their last stand. The scene below was one of desperate, frantic violence. The 12 operators were pinned down behind a rocky outcrop, their position being systematically pulverized by heavy machine gun fire and mortar rounds. A menacing, shark-like F-22 alligator attack helicopter was circling, preparing for a final, decisive gun run that would annihilate them. The extraction chopper, a F-23 Super Stallion with the call sign Lifeline, was holding a frantic orbit miles away, unable to approach. "Pathfinder, this is Lifeline. We can't get in there. That chopper has us painted." The pilot's strained voice crackled over the shared channel. "Valkyrie to Lifeline." Rostova's voice cut through the panic, preternaturally calm. "Hold your position. I'm clearing the lane." Her F-22 wasn't loaded out for a close air support mission. She had no bombs or air-to-ground missiles left. All she had were her remaining air-to-air missiles and the 480 rounds in her M61A2 Vulcan cannon. It would have to be enough. She rolled the Raptor inverted, pulling it into a steep, aggressive dive, targeting the enemy helicopter. The alligator, bristling with rockets and cannons, was a formidable ground attack machine, but in the air against a fifth-generation fighter it was a sitting duck. The helicopter pilot saw her coming, a silver streak of death descending from the heavens, and began to jink wildly, firing flares in a desperate attempt to spoof a missile that wasn't coming. Rostova had no intention of wasting a missile. She descended at nearly supersonic speed, the air screaming over her canopy. At the last possible second, she thumbed the trigger. The 20mm cannon erupted with a sound that wasn't a series of gunshots but a single, continuous, terrifying roar, like a chainsaw tearing through the fabric of the sky. A stream of incendiary shells, fired at a rate of 100 per second, stitched a perfect line across the alligator's fuselage. The helicopter disintegrated in mid-air, its rotor blades cartwheeling away from the exploding chassis. Without pausing, Rostova continued her dive, leveling out just over the heads of the enemy ground troops who were assaulting the Pathfinder's position. Her pass was so low, so fast, that the sheer force of her jet wash kicked up a hurricane of dust and rock, staggering the soldiers and throwing them into chaos. The thunderous clap of her passage was a weapon in itself, a physical blow of sound and pressure that shattered their morale. "Lifeline, your path is clear," Valkyrie stated, her voice unchanged. "You have 90 seconds. It was all the invitation the extraction pilot needed. "We're going in. Lifeline is hot." The big Super Stallion surged forward, racing towards the rocky outcrop. Rostova pulled her Raptor into a high, circling orbit, a guardian angel made of steel and fire. Her radar swept the area, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her mere presence was now a fortress wall. A fresh wave of enemy ground attack drones appeared over a nearby ridge, but she met them with cold, calculated efficiency. A quick burst from her cannon obliterated one. A single missile took out two more that were flying in close formation. She was a lone wolf holding back the entire pack. Below, the Super Stallion's ramp dropped. The battered Pathfinders scrambled aboard, providing their own covering fire. Seconds later, the chopper was airborne, heavy with the men it had saved from certain death. "Pathfinder is secure," the team leader yelled into his radio. "All personnel accounted for. Valkyrie, goddamn. Thank you." Rostova watched the H-53 climb away, heading for safety. Her job here was done. She banked the F-22, turning its nose for home, a solitary sentinel leaving a battlefield she had dominated utterly and completely alone. In the muted, blue-lit tension of the command center, no one had spoken for 10 minutes. The only sounds were the soft hum of servers and the sharp, ragged breathing of men who had just witnessed the impossible. They had seen it all through Valkyrie's gun camera feed and the tactical network, a real-time broadcast of a masterclass in aerial combat that defied every known metric and simulation. The data on their screens was a testament to an event that, by all rights, should not have happened. Lieutenant Davies was leaning against a console, his knuckles white. He was staring at the main holographic map, where Valkyrie's icon, a single friendly blue chevron, was now serenely making its way out of the still bristling, but now cowed enemy territory. He felt a dizzying mix of elation and awe. He hadn't just witnessed a successful mission. He had witnessed the birth of a legend. General Theron stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on that same icon. His arms were no longer crossed in a posture of skepticism, but hung loosely at his sides. For the first time in his decorated career, the models had been wrong. The data had been incomplete. It lacked a crucial, unquantifiable variable, the will and instinct of the pilot in the cockpit. He had dismissed Major Rostova as a maverick, a risk. He now understood that in certain, desperate circumstances, the maverick was the only solution. The system he had built his entire career on, a system of rules, procedures, and calculated probabilities, had failed. She had not. He had been proven wrong, not by a subordinate's argument or a dissenting opinion, but by an undeniable, visceral demonstration of supreme competence under fire. It was a humbling, clarifying moment. The rigid certainty that had defined him had been shattered, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He walked over to the primary communications console and took the headset from the stunned operator. He keyed the encrypted channel, his thumb resting on the transmit button for a long moment before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual authoritative bluster. It was quiet, measured, and carried a weight of sincerity that no one in the room had ever heard from him before. "Valkyrie, this is command." A pause. The line was silent for a few seconds before her voice, still impossibly level, came back. "Go ahead, command. Airspace ahead is clear all the way to the tanker. The Pathfinders are safe," Theron said. He looked at the screen, at the solitary icon that had single-handedly won the day. He cleared his throat. "Good hunting, Major." He used her rank, not her call sign. It was a deliberate, personal acknowledgement, a mark of respect that went beyond official protocol. Then he added two more words that sealed the institutional reversal. "Welcome home." From the cockpit of the F-22, Rostova heard him. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Far below, aboard the now-safe extraction chopper, the Pathfinder team leader watched the silver sliver of her Raptor bank gracefully towards the rising sun. He took off his helmet, ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, and simply nodded at the sky. Some victories were too significant for words. The return flight was a study in quiet decompression. Valkyrie linked up with a KC-135 tanker over the Gulf, taking on fuel with the same practiced, unnerving precision she'd used to dismantle the enemy's air defenses. From there, the journey back to Al Dafra was a long, silent glide through the tranquil upper atmosphere. The sun was now fully risen, a brilliant, cleansing fire that burned away the shadows of the night's work. Her landing was as flawless as her takeoff. There was no triumphant flyby, no dramatic break over the airfield. She simply eased the F-22 onto the runway with a surgeon's touch, the tires kissing the tarmac in a whisper of smoke. She taxied to her designated hardstand, the location already surrounded by a ground crew that moved with a new, unspoken reverence. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew. In the cockpit, Rostova initiated the shutdown sequence. The complex systems that had kept her alive and made her lethal spun down one by one. The vibrant green glow of the displays faded to black. The roar of the twin engines spooled down, unwinding from a thunderous bellow to a low moan, then a high-pitched whine, and finally silence. The only sounds left were the faint hum of cooling avionics and the steady, rhythmic ticking of hot metal contracting in the morning air, the sound of a beast's heart slowly coming to rest. She unstrapped herself, the clicks of the buckles loud in the stillness. When she finally actuated the switch to open the canopy, the hydraulic hiss seemed to exhale the tension of the entire mission. The dry, warm desert air flooded the cockpit, a stark contrast to the sterile, filtered atmosphere she had breathed for hours. For a moment, she just sat there, her gloved hands resting on the controls, her eyes closed. She didn't look triumphant or relieved. She simply looked centered, a woman perfectly at peace in the quiet aftermath of controlled violence. Slowly, she descended the boarding ladder. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant who had seen everything, was waiting for her at the bottom. He was a man of few words on his most talkative day. He looked at her, then at the aircraft. Its skin stained with soot and the grime of high-speed, low-altitude flight, and then back at her. He didn't salute. He didn't offer congratulations. He just held out a cold bottle of water, a simple human gesture. As she took it, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a sign of profound, absolute respect, more meaningful than any medal or citation. Rostova nodded back, the first crack in her stoic facade a faint, tired smile. She took a long drink from the bottle, the cool water a balm. Without another word, she turned and began the slow walk back toward the hangars, leaving the ground crew to tend to her aircraft. The final image was of her, a solitary figure walking away from the F-22 Raptor. The magnificent machine sat cooling on the sun-baked tarmac, its sharp, lethal lines silhouetted against the bright morning sky. A faint heat haze shimmered up from its engines, the last visible sign of the fire it had unleashed. They were a silent partnership, pilot and machine, that had flown into an impossible fight and emerged, against all odds, victorious. The general had called it a suicide run. But for Major Eva Valkyrie Rostova, it was just another day at the office. The silence that surrounded her now wasn't empty. It was filled with the heavy, unshakable weight of respect, earned not with words, but with action. The legend was now fact.